Hello and welcome to this policy exchange panel on a Conservative majority for growth. Is there a supply-side coalition? Which seems to be the debate that the party needs to have at the moment. I'm Juliet Samuel. I write a column for the Telegraph, and I'm also a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. So it's going to go that each of our panelists will talk for 5 minutes each. We have Matthew Goodwin is over Zoom, and the others who are in person, they're going to speak for 5 minutes each. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion up here, and then we will ask you guys to ask them tough questions. So we're going to start with Lord Frost, who's probably familiar to most of you, but he was the chief EU negotiator under Boris Johnson, and before that spent most of his career as a diplomat, was ambassador to Denmark, and had various senior roles in diplomacy and trade in the UK government. He was also CEO of the Scotch Whisky Association. So without further ado, Lord Frost, please kick us off.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Juliet. Thanks, everybody, for coming along. Just a few quick thoughts, really, to kind of get us talking. First of all, first point, I think, to answer the question that's in the title of this session, there must be a coalition for reform, and we must try and build one, because there's no way through the politics and the economics of the next few years that does not involve very significant free marketisation of the British economy. If that doesn't happen, we will not grow. We will not get to where we want to as a country, and it's clear what needs to be done. There needs to be significant structural reform, there needs to be fiscal restraint, and there needs to be a very gradual renormalisation of monetary policy, and all those things need to go together. And if we don't do that, then the country will stagnate and decline. And I worry, and this is really my second point, that some of the kind of sort of red Tory or blue Labour approaches to where people think the Conservative Party should be going at the moment don't engage with that reality. They seem to think that it is a reasonable choice to choose a sort of lesser, to choose against free market reform and to focus more on the sort of cultural politics of conservatism rather than the economics of it. I don't think that is a realistic way forward, because it condemns us to economic decline. So that's the framing. Third point, I think, this is sort of behind the title of this session, is that it is difficult to build a reform coalition because society has got very much more collectivist over the last 10 or 20 years. There's an assumption about the role of government, what it should do, what it can do for individuals, the extent to which it should stand behind people, that has got very deeply established. And I've written in an essay for Policy Exchange a little bit about why that's the case. But we're working on a background that is unpropitious to doing all the sorts of things that I think need to be done. You can't land free market policies in the middle of that without preparation. We've all seen John Byrne Murdoch's chart in the Financial Times over the weekend showing how far society has moved left and how far the Conservative Party seems to be out of sync with that. And you can't simply throw out a load of free market reform ideas and assume everyone will just get with the programme. There needs to be much more explanation, much more effort to persuade, to make the arguments, to bring people along with you, to understand why the arteries have kind of furred up over the last decade or two and need to be cleaned out again. So that, I think, is a really important task for the next year or so, however long this government has got. Fourth point, therefore, you need to choose the subjects where you're going to do structural reform carefully against that background. And I think some are more propitious than others, probably, to making progress. I think we should sort of err away from things that we know are going to be highly controversial and where the losers are going to be extremely visible, and try and go elsewhere. For example, a more relaxed trade policy with lower tariffs creates some losers, yes, but very slowly and over time is a very powerful symbol of competition in our own market. So that's something I think we should be doing. Financial services is another area where there are real opportunities, and the losers are, if there are any, are relatively concentrated. Reduce regulation for SMEs, another area which obviously the government has begun to pick up, I think is another way of doing this. Energy is another where we obviously need to find ways of producing more energy domestically and sort of producing something that approximates to a normal energy market again. So I would say choose the subjects that we attack over the next year or two. Don't try and do everything. Don't do things that will obviously create a coalition of losers much more quickly than they will create a coalition of winners. Last point, all this can only happen if the government can reset, I think, from where it now is, and that, I suppose, is the question for the next few days. Can the government kind of, set out an agenda, move on from the last few days of difficulties? And I think that is an open question as we speak. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. We're going to go now to Matthew Goodwin, who is an academic and pollster, and I think I'm right in saying newly appointed Commissioner for Social Mobility as of early September. If you go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Policy Exchange for hosting this timely discussion, and thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing their ideas and thoughts. I think the topic of my contribution as such is going to be around public opinion polling and the electoral aspects of this debate. And I actually agree with much of what Lord Frost just said. I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the last week was the lack of focus and energy that was devoted to taking people with the conversation, trying to explain some of the choices that had been made and why those choices had been made. But since then, what we've seen in the polls obviously is nothing short of dramatic. As my colleague John Curtis reminded me last night, in the month after the ERM crisis, it took a month for there to be a 7.5 point swing against the Conservative Party, which never recovered in the polls after that moment and that particular crisis. This time, it's taken a week for there to be a 7-point swing against the party. On current projections, on the numbers this week, you'd be looking at an overwhelming Labour majority. And one of the reasons why the Conservative vote has imploded is because the original coalition that was put together in 2019 has essentially fragmented for lots of different reasons, not just related to the events of this week, also partly a general disillusionment with the performance of the latter months of the previous government. But now I think also a philosophical separation from many of the policies that have bubbled to the surface. There are some things that were offered over the last week that were very popular. The plan to reverse national insurance rise went down very well. Lowering the basic rate of income tax, as you'd expect, went down very well. The energy plan, very popular. About 80% of people back that particular plan. But then there were the other measures that, in a sense, it's difficult to almost convey how unpopular they were. Removing the cap on bankers' bonuses, a 12% position, removing the 45% tax rate, about an 11% position. Corporation tax changes, just not very popular. And so that really exacerbated this general sense now, which I think the party is going to have to face until the next general election, which is that this agenda is not fair. 19% of voters think the policy package overall is fair. Only 1/3 of Boris Johnson's voters in 2019 think it is fair. And this is essentially the dividing line going into the next contest. And in a sense, while I accept much of what Lord Frost has just said, I think the challenge also is that the Conservative Party today has inherited a large number of voters who simply have a very different vision of what the Brexit project was all about. And a large number of those voters do not want to see an economic model that essentially doubles down on London, financial services, and the prosperous parts of the southeast, which many of these policies will, in essence, do in the short term, maybe not necessarily in the longer term if the growth gamble pays off. But as we know, most of these policies will benefit many of the communities and voters who were already benefiting for the last 30 years. And I think also, perhaps venturing more into my personal view here, I think there's been a failure to reflect on the lessons of the earlier policies in the 1980s. We do know that many of those policies made the country much more prosperous, much more competitive. And if it wasn't for those policies, we would be in a very different place today. But we also know that those reforms did come with costs. And those costs were very significant, as we know from work in economics today by David Dorn, David Autor and others, that many of the earlier supply side reforms did disproportionately impact many of the groups of voters who then went on to vote for Brexit, then went on to vote for Boris Johnson, same in America. And I think this time around, again, it didn't seem to me that there was much thought going into how some of the groups that would be hit, perhaps again by some of these policies, would be compensated. What would be the strategy for taking those voters with the party and with this new agenda? I was struck that the new Prime Minister didn't mention levelling up at all when she stood outside Downing Street. What is the long-term strategy for revitalising non-graduates and blue-collar communities? What's the strategy on immigration? We can't just say cultural issues don't matter. Cultural issues are still top 3 issues for current Conservative voters. What's the strategy for the small boats? What's the strategy for retaking control over those issues on which many 2019 Conservatives feel are still not in control? We just polled 2019 Conservatives on what their preferred limit of their preferred level of immigration is. Overwhelming numbers, 70-75% want a cap or want a maximum upper limit of around 100,000 a year. They're not going to get that under the current policy. We know that the migration debate will be the next big debate in this agenda. We know that inevitably these reforms will require high levels of ongoing inward migration, which will not, contrary to what is often said, will not actually be high-skilled migration. Right? We know that the salary thresholds at 25,000 or even 20,000 in some sectors, we're not attracting high-skilled migration. It's a very different regime from what many Leave voters and Conservatives are expecting it to be. That will exacerbate this problem that's facing the Conservatives. So I think it's not enough to say, well, culture stuff doesn't matter. We need to make the case for economic reforms. I think firstly, you're dealing with an electorate that has already decided that these reforms, this current government is not on the side of people like them. So how you start to try and explain the logic behind these reforms is challenge number one. But then also how to avoid the mistakes that were made over the last week and prepare for the next conversation, particularly the conversation around some of the cultural questions, I think is paramount. I think is going to be absolutely dominant at the next election. And that's going to take a lot of preparation and a lot of forethought. Because at the moment, and I'll leave you with one statistic that came out of the British Social Attitude Survey last week. And I just want to say, as a pollster, I accept the fact that we shouldn't always be led by the polls. I accept the argument that you need to also try and change public opinion if you're in the art of politics and you're in the art of making arguments and winning people over. But one of the stats that came out of that study, the gold standard study in British politics, that lowering taxes and lowering public spending which inevitably I think will have to follow some of the policies that were announced this week, is a 6% position. 6% of voters want to do that. Okay, most voters, the overwhelming majority, either want to keep taxes where they are, keep spending as it is. A slightly smaller number want to increase taxes to spend more on the NHS and public services because they can't get a GP's appointment, they can't get an ambulance, all of that stuff. But the lower tax, spend less is a 6% position. Okay, and I'll just sort of leave people to reflect on that, and we can take some of that into conversation.
Thanks very much, Matt. We'll now hear from Gerard Lyons, who's also a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. He's an economist, was chief economist at Standard Chartered Bank for a long time, was advisor to Boris Johnson as mayor, economic advisor, is an advisor to the current PM, and was supposedly her favourite economist, although perhaps not after this morning's interview. Anyway, we will now hear from
Yeah, I'm not an official advisor, so I'm not inside the tent or anything like that. So I wasn't privy to anything that was in the... Yeah, I'm inside this tent, but I wasn't privy to anything that was in the mini budget, or whatever one wants to call it. Look, we are where we are. Three things: target audience, the narrative, and delivering on the supply side agenda. In terms of the mini budget, it seems to me that the Chancellor got 2 of his 3 target audiences right. But even with one of those target audiences, the legacy's not really lived on. So if you think of the general public, firms, and then the markets. In terms of those who liked the mini budget, it was very much the business community, the CBI, the Institute of Directors who gave it the thumbs up. The general public should have given it the thumbs up if he had stuck to basically what was expected by the markets, and likewise with the markets. It seemed that the mini budget initially was just going to be was going to focus on the energy levy and then reversing the 2 planned tax increases. If it had just been that, then it could have been conveyed as ruling out an even deeper recession and preventing the public finances being blown to pieces. However, the mini budget went beyond that. So we had the energy levy, and then of the other changes, there was £160 billion over 5 years. But of that 160 billion increased borrowing, 82%, so 82 pence in each pound, was reversing the increase in corporation tax and reversing the increase in national insurance. It was only the other 18p that was the other changes. Now, when you don't have anyone marking your homework in terms of the OBR or others assessing it, and if you don't have the fiscal numbers really there alongside it, the markets are going to penalise you if they think it's inflationary or not affordable. So it was completely an avoidable situation. In terms of the corporation tax, just to give you an idea, actually, the economists didn't like the idea that corporation tax hike was going to be reversed, because their argument was when corporation tax came down, investment had not been boosted. But as the corporation tax came down, what happened was the tax base was widened quite significantly, so the tax take did not change. So if we were to go back to raising the corporation tax from 19 to 25%, you're raising the tax on a much wider tax base, so you're effectively clobbering the business sector. So the corporation tax increase needed to be prevented, and also, I would argue, most people knew, or economists would agree, that national insurance is a tax on jobs. The markets, I think, were already prepared for the energy levy, which was a good move, and those 2 other changes. It was all the additional changes that did not really sort of register beforehand and were therefore seen as giving fire to the narrative that this was about tax cuts and only tax cuts. Also, to come back to what Matthew was saying, the social contract is a vital part of our post-war consensus, and the failure to recognise that, he touched on it in terms of fairness, I think is key there. So the first part is, I think you need to focus on your target audience. If one was in the government now, one would be trying to stabilise the markets and then trying to get the narrative across to the general public, while leveraging off the fact that British business, the Federation of Small Business, as well as the IOD and the CBI, have currently given the big thumbs up to the policy announcements of the other week, so follow through on those. The real challenge in that respect, though, is with the markets, you've effectively empowered the institutions you were seen as not being in favour of before. You're also seen as empowering the orthodoxy that you were against before. 10 years ago, the argument from the OBR and the HMT Treasury was that growth was weak. To get the finances back into shape, you need austerity. In the last 2 years, the argument was growth is weak, finances are in poor shape, therefore you need tax increases. Liz Truss was trying to change that by going for growth. Now, because the markets need to be convinced that you're fiscally stable and fiscally disciplined, the OBR will presumably be saying you either reverse your tax cuts, you might say that started, or you actually have austerity. So effectively, we're back to the situation we were in before. So in terms of bringing your target audiences with you, what you need to do, coming back to what Matthew was saying, to get the city and the markets on side, as he was saying, it's only a 6-point move in his analogy, doesn't necessarily get the general public on side. The second point, though, is what they say as well as what they do. What they say, the pro-growth strategy really does make sense. Britain is a low-growth, low productivity, low-wage, high-tax economy. Western Europe is going the same way. The only way you can get out of that is by actually trying something different, but what is different needs to be seen to be credible. We know what you need to do to get investment up. There's clearly defined things, but the narrative is the right one, but it needs to be made clear that low taxes are not the only part of it. Cutting the top rate of tax, for instance, can be seen as a positive move if you portray it in terms of competitiveness with other centres, but you don't really want to do it in an uncosted budget, and you don't want to do it maybe in the current environment, and I was very critical of it within 2 minutes of that mini budget finishing. But tax simplification is an important thing, but that requires taking people out of fiscal drag through higher allowances and addressing higher marginal tax rates when you get to 50 grand, 100 grand, or indeed if you've just been a student, you're paying off your student loan. So that comes on to the third part. So what is the supply side? Most people don't seem to understand what the supply side is. So maybe you need to change the narrative on that and focus, as I was saying yesterday in the event, is all the eyes. It's about investment in skills and training. It's about more innovation. It's about increased infrastructure spending, and it's about the incentives in terms of lower taxes. So coming back to bring it all together, in terms of a coalition, first you need to know your target audience, but because that's been slightly screwed up in terms of the markets, that ties their hands slightly in terms of how they will impact and influence the other target audience. The second point, though, is the pro-growth strategy clearly makes sense. This country is in the low growth phase, and we need to change and get out of it. And third, the supply side agenda, I think, is part of the right story. It's not all of what you need to do. But in terms of the supply side, I think they need to make clear the specific components of it and try and get some quick wins. But overall, what's frustrating is that 80%, I would say, of that mini statement last Friday week was constructive, positive, good. But the other bits that were not, just because they overdid it, I think more than overshadowed the good parts, as we've seen in the last week and a half.
Great, thank you very much, Gerard. We will now go to our last speaker, Lee Rowley, who is MP for North East Derbyshire and has been since 2017, and is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Department for Levelling Up, which we used to call local government, but is now still officially at least levelling up.
Thank you, Juliet. Good to see everybody, and thank you for letting me speak today. So if the exam question is there a majority for supply-side change? My answer to that is yes, but sometimes you have to strain your eyes a little bit to see it. And the reason for that is because over 30 years or so, I think our politics has not been straight enough with people. We've not told people enough about the trade-offs. we've not had a good conversation with people about why issues are so difficult. The reason, if the issues that politicians have to deal with weren't difficult, they wouldn't get into the political arena in the first place. They will have been solved in some other part of the system. So everything in politics is usually usually difficult, and that means there are trade-offs which are necessary. So it's not surprising if we've not had, I'm 42, I don't think we've had a proper conversation about trade-offs in my adult life, starting with Blair. And the Blairite paradigm has been, until very recently, hopefully this government is about to change that to some extent, the Blairite paradigm has been in place throughout. So the question is, why are we surprised when parts of the country say, I'm not sure about some of these things? You know, if you talk to my part of the country is in North East Derbyshire, just south of Sheffield. My biggest town is a town called Dronfield, which I bet nobody in here has ever heard of. We are, great, excellent. You're all very welcome to Dronfield. And David, of course, coming from Derbyshire. Dronfield is one of the most beautiful parts of the world. It's consistently in the top 10 places to live in the country, but we're very quiet about it because we don't want too many people to know. But the fundamental point about places like mine is, if you take my new job, housing and planning, which I've been in for three and a bit weeks, for about 15 years, local politicians have not had an honest conversation about planning in our part of the world. That has resulted in 1,000 more houses being built than should have been built. That has resulted in a lack of upgrade to the infrastructure in our part of the world. And it's meant that some parts of North East Derbyshire have been built on that people aren't very happy about. So it's quite understandable. It's not unusual that if you then come and have this conversation on the basis of that context, that people will be less clear about or less objectively enthusiastic about some of these difficult discussions that we've got to have. So the question is, if you start from that place, what do you do about it? And I think there are three things which I would just put on the table for discussion. One is, breaks into a few parts, but one is I think you have to be straight with people. You have to talk to them about the trade-offs. You then have to trust them to do the right thing most of the time. Most of these difficult decisions can be taken locally. Most of these conversations can be had in individual localities because we think most people will do the right thing most of the time. When you have the right to have those conversations, be it about housing or planning in a local area, with rights come responsibilities. And it's the government's job to create frameworks which create incentives to get to an answer which benefits the country as a whole. So you will have seen, hopefully some of you, the government's announcement of investment zones just a few days ago, which is a real attempt to say, do you know what, everybody gets very frustrated with the planning system. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, you want to do something, central government wants you to do something, let's find a way to try and make that work a lot more quickly and a lot more easily than it historically would have done through a slower planning system, and the applications are currently open. So we're very hopeful that we'll get lots of applications and we'll see where we go with those. So the first question is, the first point I think to put on the table is that you have to have that kind of more open conversation with people, more clear-cut conversation with people, and to trust them to do the right thing. The second thing is I think you've got to make growth real. You know, I completely support what the Prime Minister is doing here. The Prime Minister is only 3 or 4 weeks into her tenure, but we've got to actually explain what growth is. Why does it matter for somebody in one of my villages in Tupton? What does growth mean to them in the next 15, 20 years? We've got to make that real in terms of the jobs that it offers, in terms of the opportunities it opens up, in terms of the improvements that will come to the local school, in terms of the greater skills that their children can have so they can build even better lives than they've got. Growth unlocks so much things for communities all across the country, but we've got to talk in the way that growth is real rather than a academic discussion about what GDP looks like. And then thirdly, once we have that growth, what do we want to do with it? We hope it will empower people, which is exactly the Prime Minister's point. But equally, if it is growing the pie, which we've been talking about for the last month, what are we going to do with that pie growth? How do we make sure that the public services work for places like North East Derbyshire? And how do we make sure that as well as growing things, we're putting in place a programme around what we're doing in government to ensure that we're reforming, that we're changing, that we're improving, that we're making better over the long term? So completely agree with the principle of growth. I think there is absolutely a majority out there, and the job of the government in the next few months is to explain it, as we're trying to do, in a way which makes it real for people and makes them understand the benefits which will bring to their lives in the long term.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask 2 or 3 quick questions of the panel, and then you guys will have your chance to ask them questions. And the first one I'm going to ask is about, there's been a bit of a discussion about tax and some mention of the other part of it, which is, deregulation and planning. The Tories have had, I think, 3 attempts to reform planning. All of them have been abandoned or watered down. There's no third runway built at Heathrow. Our energy policy is a mess. There's no fracking, wind farms, even solar panels now seem to be in question. There's no new nuclear. There's no liberating trade deals, employment law reform, etc. So I just wonder of our panelists, which of these things can happen, is viable, despite all the evidence that it hasn't happened yet. And Lee, since you're on housing, maybe you could talk first about that.
Sure. Easy question. I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of the points you make, but I understand the broader question that you're asking. The planning is a very, very, very sensitive issue, and it's understandably very sensitive because it changes communities in perpetuity, and we have to accept that and try and work with the grain of people. And as you rightly highlight, in the past couple of years alone, there have been several attempts to try and change the planning system. There is one going through the process at the moment, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which will include quite some significant changes around planning. I think just to use the same example as previously, there's going to be some further announcements on planning in the coming weeks ahead, which I obviously can't anticipate here today. But if you use investment zones, I think the key point is that real attempt to align incentives here. What is it out there? How do we get more housing? How do we get more commerce? How do we get more industry? And crucially, how do we get it quicker? Well, we try and work with people. We're not foisting investment zones on anybody. It is completely optional. We hope we will get applications. There've been a lot of areas that have indicated at a high level that they want to do that, but it's their choice about whether to apply, and then it's their choice about what to put in that application. And then it's trying to work with government in a partnership, say, okay, this bit of land, most people in the locality says that we want it to look like this in as quickly as possible. So how can government help you unlock that land so that it builds the houses that people need in order to be able to get on the housing ladder, or it opens up the factory, or it encourages people to come to that? So I hope that is a first indication of an incentive alignment, which hopefully might make these kind of conversations a little bit easier in the future.
Do either of you want to say anything on infrastructure planning and the deregulatory side of supply side?
I'm not sure I've really got anything to add to what Lisa. I think in the short run, there is no alternative to a set of sort of penny packet type measures. Caricaturing slightly, I know, but small things that can make a difference, allowing incentives, trying to get people to look at it in a different way. I don't think it'll be enough, but I also don't think we can rush at anything more ambitious. We have to again come back to persuading people, and the next year or two, I think, needs to be in part devoted to explaining to people that there will have to be more ambitious economic planning reform, and trying to define the terms of that. And it will be painful, but I don't see there's any alternative but to try and make it happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you just picked up an economic basic textbook, it would tell you sort of things like land, labour, capital, skills, energy. So land, no planning reform. Skills, big skills gap in the UK. Energy, no energy policy. Capital, very low investment. Skills, we had a very open migration policy. That might not change. So the basics you know. In fact, there's half a dozen things you need to do to boost private investment. I won't bore you with the long list, but it's all out there, proven. I think the biggest challenge has been not just the failure to progress on the areas you've mentioned, but one thing we haven't mentioned today is we've spent 14 years becoming used to cheap money. And so cheap money, we're now out of a cheap money phase. There's going to be a big adjustment to that. But cheap money deters you from taking necessary action elsewhere because it encouraged people to just rely on cheap money as the answer to everything.
Well, I was going to ask about interest rates, but I will, in the interest of time, I will let that conversation come up because you've already sort of answered what I was going to ask. So I will just ask whether, is there actually a majority in this country for a smaller state? And I mean, so far the argument seems to be, well, yes, but it hasn't been done right. And I'm just going to read a quote, of the last week from another columnist called Sam Friedman. He's of the centre left, but his comment was the relationship between free market think tankers and actual markets seems roughly equivalent to that between Marxist intellectuals and actual workers. And so, the question being, there's lots of theory about how a smaller state is great, but actually when it comes down to it, NHS, defence spending, social care reform, etc., actually, are these things electorally toxic? So,
What about Matthew?
yes. Why don't we have Lord Frost and then Matthew, you can, if you want to comment on that.
So I think there has to be a majority for a smaller state, and part of the way of getting there is to explain to people how big the state currently is. Nobody is suggesting a kind of night watchman state, and as we keep saying, if we get the state down to the size it was when Gordon Brown was in power, we'd feel we'd done pretty well. And I think there must intellectually be a limit. I think almost everyone in mainstream politics would accept there is a limit to how big the state can grow. Therefore, there must be a point at which you say stop and try to reverse it. And I think we have passed that point, and taking 2 or 3% out of the size of the state and reversing the trend doesn't seem to me like an impossible thing to do. It has happened before, and it can happen again. What has happened is that people's expectations of what can be provided by the state and public services have got out of line with the productive capacity of the economy, and that's a sort of intellectual way of putting the point about growth. We need more growth if people's expectations for what the state can do are to be realised. You don't get to that by indefinite growth of the state.
Matthew, you've slightly answered this already, but is there any other comment you want to add on it?
Well, I think we sometimes talk about the state in a way that perhaps glosses the reality of how people think about the state. I think if you present those arguments in terms of state inefficiency, it becomes easier to have a conversation with voters about, for example, why, if we're spending 190 billion on the National Health Service, but the National Health Service is not delivering as well as it could deliver for voters, and that's why we need to talk more openly as a country about how we reform public services. And I think the conversation becomes an easier one to have. The problem the Conservative Party has at the moment with this particular policy package is that voters have clearly already concluded that this is about reducing the state at the expense of the quality of public services that they already perceive to be very, very poor. And so I think the reframing of that conversation probably needs to happen, and is probably a legacy of the last 20 years, if not longer, in British politics. But I would add that when I talked about the 6% position, that has remained constant. If you can go back all the way to the early 90s in the BSA data, the British Social Attitudes data, and this idea of kind of streamlining and lowering tax and lowering the amount we're spending overall on public services is, generally speaking, has always been a minority position in the country.
The challenge, sorry, is this working? I think the challenge is it will go the other way. If the government doesn't make the case in the next 2 years, Labour will come in, they will argue that UK tax rates are lower than in some other countries in Europe, and they will naturally say that you need to tax the thing that's not mobile, housing. We do tax housing more than any other country in the OECD, but in a very inefficient way. So capital gains on housing will be seen as another source of tax revenue. So I think it's only when the opposition will be in the ascendancy, arguing that if after 12 years in power, albeit 5 of them were in a coalition, and albeit because of COVID and everything else, war in Ukraine, it wasn't a smooth trajectory, the argument will be the other way. And then I would expect to see the Brexit debate come back on the table as well.
Lee, do you briefly want to say something before the audience asks?
I mean, I agree with Matthew. The question is not the size of the state. And by the way, I'm an advocate of a smaller state. But the question is, how do you make a state effective? The people in Dronfield or Kilmarshall, where I represent as a constituents MP, they are frustrated because they can't get in to see their GPs. They want their potholes filled in. They want the visible elements of the state that they see, that they rely on, that they have a right to believe are delivered effectively, to demonstrate that that's the case. And in many ways that happens, but we know that there have been challenges over the last few years, which means that there are some strains in the system, and that is the focus that we've got to do. It's an effective state. My view of an effective state is a state that does some things well rather than lots of things badly, hence why I think the state should trend in a smaller direction. But we shouldn't talk about it in the sense of small or big. We should talk about it in the sense of effectiveness.
Great. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question and say who you are and your affiliation. Right, we'll try and get through as many as possible. Can we have you, sir, in the front? There's a mic coming to you.
Ian Morling from Winchester Conservative Association. I'm thrilled, having been to the party conference in 1981, so Thatcher regime, to see the growth plan. And I was deeply skeptical, but when I downloaded, I saw 40 pages with at the end a whole list of very specific projects. So it seems to be a coherent plan. But the main criticisms, and you summarize them, A, is it fair? But B, and this is a major one for Gerard and all the economists of all different ilks, Patrick Minford included, is it credible? Because that's the other major criticism, does trickle-down work? And how far? I'm a great believer in bottom-up. In other words, finding the entrepreneurs. The ONS does remarkable statistics by constituency, which I got working during the UK TPO, the UK Trade Policy Observatory, did at my request a look at each constituency to see what potential impacts were of Brexit. You've got to look at the sectors, because you've got winners and losers in each sector. So if you're going to look at investment, who is going to invest? How are the jobs created? So I think there's got to be a grassroots, in fact, a bedrock analysis to make sure it's credible. The fairness you've discussed, you haven't yet discussed, is it credible? Which is what many of the major American economists, Larry Summers and others, Martin Wolf recently in the Financial Times, have been saying, this is not credible.
Okay. Is it credible?
Yeah, hello. Well, in terms of the numbers, you see, there was a whole combination of factors. But yeah, the fiscal change is necessary. It's non-inflationary and it's affordable. But again, you need to cost it completely. Right, what's the challenge? In the American markets, they were particularly concerned about the perception that the bank and the Treasury were putting in opposite directions. Because the normal perception is that if you have an inflation shock, then you have both monetary tightening and fiscal tightening. What's interesting is the nature of our inflation shock is a supply side shock exacerbated by poor monetary policy. We actually have weak domestic demand at the moment. So there is the scope and the argument to ease fiscal policy to boost domestic demand without exacerbating the inflation outlook. But the US markets didn't believe that. But that needed to be confronted. In terms of the affordability, because there was no numbers attached to it, that led people to be concerned. Now, when Brown became Chancellor in 1997, he introduced fiscal rules, which were there to prove he's credible. They remained unchanged to 2008. Then the first shock, they went out the window, and we've had 8 reiterations since. So the fiscal rules are there to satisfy people, but we ditched them. The real fiscal rule that matters is debt to GDP. We have the second lowest debt to GDP in the G7. So bringing debt to GDP down, it's 90% now, it was the 250% after the Second World War. That makes it credible, but it makes it credible if you have the growth and if people believe you have the growth. I think your initial question about trickle-down economics, you see, trickle-down economics, in my view, is nonsense, and no one I know believes in it. But the narrative made it about taxes, maybe because the Conservatives were trying to appeal to a domestic audience and not to the market. So they associated this policy with the trickle-down, and hence that tax cut. It wasn't just about the fairness, as you called it. It was about the perception that it gave, or it reinforced this perception it's only about tax cuts. Whereas to actually show you've got the growth, you need to show the success or your policies in other areas. And as you correctly said, there was 40 pages in the report or whatever it was that accompany it. So, yeah, the markets weren't convinced. Hence, we're now back into the situation, as I touched on, where the medium-term fiscal plan is late in November. My view was they needed to outline their fiscal principles, not do more than the market expected, etc.
We'll go back to the lady at the back there. Wait for the mic to come and say your name and affiliation.
Thanks. My name's Claire Golby. I'm Deputy Leader of Nuneaton and Bedworth Borough Council with responsibilities for housing and communities. And I also sit on Warwickshire County Council as the Chair of Overview and Scrutiny of Adult Social Care and Health. So I sit across a number of things that are affected by finance, effectively. And it's something that you said, Lee, about the small government. Local government is the face of government to the majority of people in this country, and we are being strangled because we are not being financed properly. We have to submit for every penny that we get, and we're having to make some really tough decisions. And that's okay, because that's what we're there for. But actually, when we are making tough decisions with a backdrop of Westminster behaving in this manner, it's not good. It's affecting us all. So I would like to see better funding for local government so we can actually deliver services while Westminster are trying to sort themselves out and do the larger government elements of running the country. But local government really do need some attention when it comes to finances. So is this something that you can take back or give us an idea of what actually local government funding is going to do for us?
Lee?
Actually, I don't cover local government, and I cover housing and planning. But I will certainly talk to my colleague Paul Scully about that. I just say one or two things, if I may. I was a councillor for 8 years. I was on the front line like you. I had a marginal ward. I had to work very heavily to keep it, and I was immensely grateful for the work that everybody in local government has taught me in terms of being able to go into Westminster subsequently. So I get how difficult it's been. I was a councillor at a time when there was a lot of money around the system. I know there hasn't been a lot of money around the system for quite a while. The challenge nationally, irrespective of some of the difficulties of the last year or so, which I accept and acknowledge, is the job of government, unfortunately, is to marry infinite demands with very finite resources. And everybody has a good reason why they need additional cash. And they are always usually good reasons. And the challenge is to try and weigh that balance. And it's a very difficult one. It's an imperfect one. We will get it wrong sometimes. We know that local government has been very clear for a number of years that it's had challenges. I will certainly pass it back to Secretary of State and to the Minister responsible.
More questions? Let's have here in the front. Just here. By the way, please try to keep your questions as brief as possible so we can fit more in. Just here.
Hello. Yes, the main thing is that I would like the panel to comment on that not only the appropriateness of the policies, there has to be a fertile environment for it. Like if we look back, Edward Heath's initial in the 1970 election, it was a typical Tory manifesto, but the ground was not right at that time, because until and unless the Labour experiment had to be shown to be utterly broken, which was the advantage, plus the 5 years of the opposition that Thatcher had to explain to the public. So those two things got together. At the moment, we don't expect Keir Starmer to shout that we have got the second lowest GDP, debt ratio. So all the things that the public are being told, they go against the supposition of this supply-side coalition. So maybe we have to wait for a more fertile ground.
Okay. Does anyone want to respond to that? It wasn't so much a question, but...
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the communication needs to be thought through, and the job of politicians is to try and argue that every day. And I think there have been some acknowledgements on the part of some senior members that we need to look at our communications on that, and we need to do that. But underneath these policies, which grow the size of the pie, which make sure that hopefully communities over the long term can thrive and grow and prosper, and people can make better decisions, people can hopefully achieve more, and we give them more opportunities to do that, and they can aspire to more, are absolutely the right thing to do. Our job to go out and sell it, absolutely.
Okay, we'll try and squeeze in a few more questions and keep them really brief. There, and also say your name, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Dominic Stanford, the chairman of Birmingham Edgbaston Association. Our parliamentarians are going to be under a lot of pressure in the next couple of years from their constituents. The reforms we're talking about are not the easy route politically by any means. Do the Parliamentary Party have the nerve to carry through these reforms? Do they have the teeth to actually go through with them? And secondly, will they actually take effect in time for us to have measurable outcomes before the next general election?
Maybe David or Lee could respond to that.
So I'll let Lee comment on whether the Parliamentary Party's got the nerve. On the second point, I think it is inevitable that whatever we do is not going to have much effect by the time of the next general election. Some of it can, I think, but I think so much of it is about sort of striking the right direction and setting out the plan and explaining what we're trying to do, so that, you know, if hopefully we've got a good manifesto and can win the election, some of this becomes a bit easier after it. And that's why I put so much emphasis on explaining, communicating, trying to build the coalition now for later, rather than rushing it now in the hope of showing results, but actually rushing it, you know, planting the seeds on ground that is just too stony, and it just doesn't grow in the way we hope. That's the risk, I think.
Lee, briefly, does your party have the nerve?
Well, hopefully, it's probably a short answer. But you know, people go into politics because they believe in things, they want to change things, they want to make things better. And you know, the media always focus on all the splits and all the rest of it. But ultimately, it's not unhealthy to have a debate and a dialogue about what needs to be done. But I think, you know, most of us, well, all of us broadly are within the same Conservative family. We all want roughly the same things, and I hope that means we can find a pathway through it. I'm confident we will be able to do so.
Okay, I don't like to do this, but we're going to take 3 questions really in a row and then come back to the panel, and I want them to be really brief. There, and there.
Hi, my name's Ewan. I'm from Gower and Swansea Conservatives. Obviously, I think there can be a majority for this supply-side reform, but then how do we get it through the system? That's the question, because it seems a bit that the air's gone out of the balloon on Whitehall and public sector reform a bit. So how do we actually deliver this plan in a practical sense? You know, is it through delivery units, or are they all too dissimilar? Does it need to be a general plan across government? You know, what's the strategy when you're in government to deliver these things?
Okay, and those 2 there.
Thank you, Charles Prestory, Southampton Itching Conservatives. My question is really for Matt. You talked in your intro about that a lot of some of the things within the mini budget accorded with the values that people have, and they were positive. So the question is really, which aspects of the kind of the budget and the plan going forwards to improve growth do you think fit with the values that voters have, and that Gerard and the other economists would agree will actually get growth going? What is still in the art of the possible that fits with voters' values, and what your colleagues John Curtis and James Johnson would agree with as well?
Okay, and just behind you. Oops.
My question for Lord Frost, Johnny Andrews, Northern Ireland Conservatives. With regards to tariffs, I thought the whole point of Brexit was that we would have less protection and we'd get out of being a protectionist state, which is what the EU is. Have we actually ever reduced any tariffs? And I mean, presumably at the margins, it's very confusing to know what's actually going on in government. There was some headlines in various papers in the autumn that the government, I think the former Prime Minister had, asked for some report to be done on this and what tariffs would be reduced. I always thought that some tariffs had been reduced, but it appears that none have really been reduced. Just wondering if you can clarify and if there's any sort of supply side benefits in reducing tariffs.
Right. So on practical delivery, the kind of institutional structures to do this, anyone have bright ideas?
Well, you and I completely agree. The point of politics is both policy making and policy delivery. And sometimes the policy delivery, because it's hard, it's not sexy, it doesn't make the headlines, it falls out of the political discussion to some extent. It's the job of government and government ministers to try and make sure that doesn't happen. I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for a year and a half, and we saw horror shows in the previous Parliament of what was coming back, of brilliant policies which were not delivered and were losing the country a lot of money. We have a great opportunity to try and both make the right policies, which is part of the discussion over the last 4 weeks, but also make sure that the ones which are underway at the moment are implemented.
And David's going to answer that and the question about tariffs at the same time.
Sure. I think we should see civil service reform, public sector reform as kind of one of the supply side reforms that has to happen. I know it sort of strictly speaking isn't, but I think it's so important to delivery of what needs to be delivered. I do think the Northcote-Trevelyan model of civil service is broken and needs some change, and that's going to require some debate. It's not something we should rush. We should try and get this right. In the short run, I think ministers need allies in their jobs, and I would say that means more rather than fewer special advisors, and special advisors of all backgrounds who are capable in policy so they can get things through. That was the biggest short-term difference. So I think it's a mistake to restrict the number. I think it should go the other way. On tariffs, the government did reduce some tariffs after the end of the transition period. I think there has been some work done on some more. At the moment, we have a trade policy that's a giant trade preference system for the EU that gets zero tariffs and most others don't. And I think that needs to balance out, both to bring prices down and both to improve competition on our own market. And it feels like that's a straightforward thing that could be done tomorrow, and we really should.
Okay, we'll go to Matt for the question about whether any parts of the budget are saleable or doable to the electorate.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as I said at the outset, there are policies that we've heard a lot about over the last week that are very popular. The changes around national insurance, income tax, the energy plan. These things have gone down very well by any standard measure, and I think we should remember that that's happened in the context of a country in which about 58 to 60% of people will lean instinctively left on economics. So by that I mean they're instinctively open to the idea of redistributing resources from the better off to the worse off. They generally think workers are not getting their fair share of the nation's wealth, and they generally believe that there's one law for the rich and another for the poor. So even within that context, some of the policies that we've heard about have landed pretty well. The challenge is that only about 10% of the country overall lean clearly on the right economically. And so when you talk about some of the other policies that were announced around your bankers' bonuses, financial services, loosening or removing, giving tax breaks to high earners, these are only ever going to be marginal positions. Now, it might be that Lord Frost is right that actually, if these had been framed in a different way, if the trade-offs had been made clear. Personally, I don't think the strategy for growth was ever communicated in a particularly convincing way, or in a way that voters would comprehend and make sense of. But nonetheless, those policies really did go down very, very badly among voters. So there are things that are popular, but it's about learning to navigate within this context in which for every one voter that's instinctively leaning right, there are 6 that are leaning left. And that's a difficult context for any Conservative Party to operate in. The only reason the Conservatives won a large number of those voters over, I would argue, in 2019 was because they also matched those voters both on cultural questions, which voters prioritised, and they also began to match them on issues around Brexit and also levelling up, which again, as I said earlier on, we're not hearing that much about at the moment.
Right, we're going to give the last word to Gerard, who's going to briefly say one more thing.
Oh, okay. Right. What Matt said in terms of those policies that were popular, a change in national insurance, income tax, energy plans, highlights the fact that if the mini budget had been kept to the minimum, it would have probably landed well. Tax simplification allows the ability for allowances to be increased significantly. There is more scope there on the marginal tax rates to win over the public. But the important thing is that, right, by 2024, the economy will probably be on the way up. The world economy is slowing. The UK economy is slowing now. Inflation, though, is likely to peak globally and in the UK in the autumn. Interest rates are heading higher. Unfortunately for the Conservatives, they managed last week, despite the fact that global rates are rising, despite the fact that UK rates would have to rise anyway, they have allowed the electorate to associate higher interest rates with the Conservative Party. So the party probably needs to break out of that. But the point is, the policies need to be registering by the end of next year. Then you still have 2.25 years probably before the next election. January 2025 is when the election needs to be held by. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually go the full distance. And we basically, therefore, have a year of economic growth in 2024. But as we saw in 92 to 97, things can be determined well before you get to 97, i.e. before the election.
Okay, well, with that, hold tight. Maybe it will all come good. We will end. Thank you very much, and sorry we couldn't get all your questions in.